Keeping your chain lubed is as much a part of mountain biking as the actual mountain biking itself, which sounds a bit nuts, but we still see people getting this wrong. It's quite easy to get this wrong, so let's get to the bottom of this and show you how to lube your chain properly once and for all. A little bit about chains first before we talk about soaking them in oil, because it will help you understand things. Now, chains are made up of a number of components, and other than the fact they're a bit lighter now, they're a bit narrower, stuff like that, haven't really changed a lot since the first chains in 1869, which sounds mad, doesn't it? Now, a lot of people wonder why, or wonder when we're actually going to be leaving these external transmissions behind in favour of things like belt drives and gearboxes. But the simple fact is we haven't found anything that works as well as the chain does, with as little friction in foul conditions and also being cost effective. There simply isn't a better current option. Okay, so each chain has 4 major components to it. You have these inner plates, you have the outer plates, you have the pins that go through them to hold it all together, and then you have the rollers that rotate around those pins. Now, the rollers are where you actually need to get the lubricant in, but let's just talk a little bit about these because it's kind of interesting. The fact that the internal width of the chain, which is the roller width between the 2 inner plates, is pretty much the same on all chains for 9 up to 12 speed. So it's 2.18 millimeters here. It's the external width that changes. Now, interestingly, the fewer gears you have, the wider the chain will be. The more gears you have, the narrower the chain will be. So on my bike, I have a 12-speed chain, and when you look it up close, you'll notice that it has loads of little chamfered edges on those leading plates. And that's because the chain has to bend laterally to get up to these massive gears and back down to the small ones as efficiently as possible. It's really quite interesting. Now, there's something called chain stretch that you might have heard of. This is when a chain wears. Now, don't get me wrong, this can be a misleading term. You're not physically stretching those metal plates, but what happens is you change the chain pitch over time. Now, all modern mountain bike chains have a chain pitch of 1/2 inch. So that refers to distance effectively between those 2 pins. A full chain link is 1 inch. That's an outer plate and an inner plate. So half link, 1/2 inch, full link, 1 inch. Over time, the chain actually stretches, but what happens here for this misleading term is the inner diameter of those rollers, they kind of bore out as they sort of wear. The whole chain gets a bit baggy, and as a result, those rollers that have to sit in the troughs between the sprockets, whether it's your cassette on the rear or the chainring on the front, they start wearing on the wrong part of the sprocket, and then, as well as the chain being worn and costing you money, it's going to cost you further money because it's going to be wearing the wrong part of the cassette and the wrong part of the sprockets at the front there. It all adds up, which is why one of the best tools you should own is a chain checking tool, and replace your chain before it gets worn. Sounds madness, right? Not using the chain until it's done, but this will save you money in the long run. You can get 2 or 3 chains to 1 cassette and 1 chainring if you do this right. Okay, so a little bit about lubricants now. So this one is important. You do need to pay attention. So there's a lot of different stuff. But what about 3-in-1 oils and other sort of household oils you might already have? You know, generic sort of stuff. Well, yeah, arguably it's still a lube. You could still put it on your chain and still go for a ride. But the fact is, most oils, like those sort of things, they're going to attract far more crap than a dedicated chain lube. And the fact is, they're just generic lubes. They're generic. They're not good enough for the job long term. So if you want good performance out of your transmission, you want it to last well, you want it to be quiet, you want the gear shifting to be really good, you need a specific chain lube. So there's a few different options available to you. Firstly, there's the spray lube. Now, spray lubes are great for using on chains, but they're very generic as far as bike lubricants go. Good value because you can use it in various places on the bike, no doubt, ideal if you're on the road. However, they can be a bit wasteful in application, and they tend to not stay in place quite as well as some of the other heavier duty lubes. And then you get the 2 main style of very specific chain lubricants. You get a wet lube and you get a dry lube. Now, starting with the wet lube, as you might have guessed, it's very wet and it's designed for use in wet conditions. We're talking wet, rainy, muddy, all that sort of stuff that essentially would actually get into your chain and do loads of damage. Now, wet lube is thick. It's very thick lube, very viscous liquid, and it's designed to be a very water repellent barrier to really sort of protect that chain and keep it wet. The downside to this sort of lubricant is if you're to use it in dry conditions, everything is going to stick to your transmission. I mean, look at this one. This has had a wet lube on, it's been ridden in dry conditions. You can see the amount of stuff that's stuck on the chain. That is not good because that forms like a grinding paste and it's just going to wear things out faster. So that is a no-no. Wet lube for wet conditions and dry lube for dry conditions. Now, the misleading thing about dry lube is the fact that it's still actually wet when you actually pour it on the chain. However, the wet part in a dry lube is essentially a solvent carrier. So it's just a carrying vessel of liquid designed to get those lubricating particles into the chain where it needs to go, and then the wetness will actually just evaporate, leaving a dry finish on the chain. Brilliant stuff for dry conditions because nothing's going to stick to it, so it's going to do its job really well without hindering your drivetrain. But terrible for wet conditions because dry lube just isn't very water repellent because there's nothing there like that thick wet liquid you get in the wet lubes. So ideally, you probably want to have one of each of those to suit different conditions and different times of year that you ride in, unless you live in the desert and it's just dry the whole time. Now, within wet and dry lubes, there's a few variants as well. So the first option, ceramic-based lubes. Now you can get this in wet and dry lube. Imagine it's like a super performance version of a standard wet and dry lube because it has ceramic particles in there. Now, ceramic, as we know, is very hard wearing stuff. So essentially, it's just a posh lubricant that just lasts a lot longer. The downsides, a bit pricier, but it lasts longer. Your call if you want to use that. And then you get a wax-based lube. Now, wax-based lubes tend to be dry, as in a dry style lubricant for dry conditions, and the carrier itself will basically dry into a waxy coating on the chain. So it has the same effect as a dry lube, and arguably it could be slightly better in certain conditions, but the biggest limitation with a wax-based lube is it needs to be applied to an immaculate chain. So arguably it's better for our road riding friends than it is in an off-road application. But nonetheless, it's a good lubricant to use. So before you start applying lube to your chain itself, you've got to think of this as a bit of a three-step process. You need to make sure that everything is cleaned before you do this. Then you need to make sure that you protect the chain. So if you've cleaned your bike, maybe using water, a bucket and a brush, you're going to need to use a corrosion inhibitor basically to flush out that moisture. You don't want to be putting lubricant on a chain when your chain is sopping wet. Okay, so clean, protect, and then finally lubing your chain. So think of it as a three-step process. Now, the general rule of thumb when lubing your chain is don't just pour more oil in. If you go to any bike shop and you ask them to see a bad transmission on the bike, they're going to show you a customer's bike they've just kept on adding more and more oil, and you end up with this horrible big black mess of a bike. Don't do this. It's disgusting and it wears things out. What you want to do is have a nice clean chain for every application. Now, how far you go with that depends on how filthy your bike is. So you've got three options. First one, obviously, wash your bike. So if you're washing your bike, you're naturally going to lube the bike afterwards. But before you do that, make sure you use a corrosion inhibitor to sort of drive out moisture in the chain. Otherwise, you're essentially, when you put the lube back on the chain, you're going to lock that moisture on the inside. So that's not a good thing for corrosion. The second option is by using some kind of chain bath or a chain cleaner. That's one of these little fellas. You put a drivetrain cleaner in, you run your chain through it, and it takes all the stuff off your chain like magic. Works really, really well. And the final option, if your chain is pretty clean, perhaps you've been riding just in dry conditions and it looks really good at a glance, is to use a bit of drivetrain cleaner just on a rag and just run the chain through it. And of course, make sure it's nice and dry again before applying your lubricant. So today I'm using a dry lube, but the principle is the same no matter what you use. You do this the same process. So it doesn't matter if your bike's in a work stand or it's on the floor, just lean it up in a way that you're going to be able to rotate the pedals backwards. That's the key to this. So first up, get some shop towel or an old rag, something like that, just to catch any drips that are likely to go on the floor, especially if you're doing this indoors, like in your front room. You get crucified for that. Then you want to make sure that you're lubing the correct part of the chain. Now, I've seen people lube the chain on the top side before. Now, arguably, in wet conditions, you kind of want the most amount of lube on there as possible, but bear in mind, any lube you pour on the top part of the chain here is just going to sit on it, attracting dirt to it. It's the underside of the chain that really needs that lubricant. So you want to be lubing the chain on the bottom part, underneath your chainstay, the most effective place for applying lube. Pick somewhere that's quite close to the rear derailleur so you can hold your bottle of lube and allow you to rotate your transmission backwards while you're doing this. That way you can get an even coating on every single roller. It's the rollers that you really need to get the lubricant on so it can really penetrate to the inside and allow them to move as freely as possible. If they're lubricated properly, they're going to last a bit longer and ride a bit smoother. And to make things easy for yourself, rotate your chain around until you find your joining link. Start at the joining link and end at the joining link. That way you know you've done a full lap and you're not using excess lubricant you just don't need to. Now with dry and wet lubes, there's a few different things you need to do here. So with a dry lube, it's vital to make sure it dries properly on the chain afterwards so that that wet carrier evaporates. So it depends on what brand lube you use, but it's often around 10 minutes time it needs to just evaporate. So factor that in before you go for a ride. Go and have a cup of tea, whatever you fancy doing, before you're going to hit the trails. And you won't need to wipe off any excess on there, generally speaking, with dry lubes. With wet lubes though, you've got two main options depending on the conditions you're going to ride in. The first option, of course, is to let it soak in a little bit, a few minutes perhaps, and then wipe off the excess, and then go and hit the trails. Or if it's really foul out, well, the more the merrier. Don't touch it, just go and hit the trails immediately. The more lube is on there for when you're riding in really wet, horrible conditions, the less likely corrosion is going to get inside that chain and start doing damage to it. That's really all there is to it. Picking the right lube, making sure your chain is prepped, and putting the lube in the correct place. As with any maintenance on your bike, it's often just a systematic approach. Nice and simple. Just make sure you keep an eye on your drivetrain, especially chain wear, and making sure your chain is lubricated, and your bike will serve you well for many, many miles. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. If you've got any comments, please do let us know in the comments underneath, and we'll see you in the next one. See ya.